Edward Conklin isn't your typical janitor at Riverside Corporate Plaza. Every night for the past 6 months, he's been watching Taylor Smith, the ambitious marketing executive who works late on the 14th floor, slowly falling apart. What starts as a simple gesture of handing her a tissue will reveal a secret that changes both their lives forever. And what Taylor discovers about this quiet single father will shock everyone who thought they knew what real success looks like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Corporate Plaza hummed their familiar tune as Edward Conklin pushed his cleaning cart down the polished marble hallway of the 14th floor. It was 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and most of Northbridge City's business district had long since emptied out, leaving only the ambitious, the desperate, and the cleaning crew to occupy the towering glass monuments to commerce. Edward had worked these floors for 3 years now, ever since his world had been turned upside down. At 42, he'd never imagined he'd be emptying trash cans and mopping floors in a corporate building, but life had a way of humbling even the most carefully laid plans. His weathered hands, once smooth from years behind a desk, now bore the calluses of honest labor, cleaning supplies, vacuum handles, and the endless cycle of maintenance that kept the corporate world spinning. The heavy-duty cleaning cart squeaked slightly as he maneuvered it around the corner toward the marketing department. He'd learned to time his routes perfectly over the years, knowing exactly which offices would be empty, which executives stayed late, and which ones barely acknowledged his existence. Most people looked right through him, as if the navy blue uniform and name tag made him invisible. In many ways, Edward preferred it that way. Invisibility had become his superpower, allowing him to observe the human drama that unfolded in these sterile corridors without anyone realizing he was paying attention. But there was one person who had captured his attention in a way that both concerned and intrigued him. Taylor Smith, senior marketing manager for Meridian Dynamics, had been working increasingly late hours, and Edward couldn't help but notice the gradual transformation taking place before his eyes. 6 months ago, Taylor had been the picture of corporate success, always impeccably dressed in designer suits, her blonde hair perfectly styled, striding confidently through the halls with an air of someone who belonged in the upper echelons of the business world. She was the kind of person who said good evening to the cleaning staff, which already set her apart from most of her colleagues. Edward remembered being struck by her genuine smile and the way she actually made eye contact when she spoke to him. But recently, something had changed. The designer suits had given way to more affordable options, though she still maintained her professional appearance. The confident stride had become hurried, almost frantic. And most telling of all, Edward had begun to notice the signs of someone under tremendous pressure. The way she rubbed her temples during phone calls, the growing stack of papers on her desk that never seemed to diminish, and the increasingly late hours she was keeping. Tonight, as Edward approached the marketing department, he could see the familiar glow of Taylor's desk lamp through the glass partition. It was the only light on in the entire department, creating a lonely island of activity in the sea of darkened cubicles. He paused for a moment, observing her through the reflection in the window. She was hunched over her laptop, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and even from a distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders. Edward had developed an unusual routine over the past few months. Instead of cleaning Taylor's office area first and potentially disturbing her work, he would save it for last, timing his arrival for when she typically took her late evening coffee break. This allowed him to clean efficiently while also ensuring she had privacy for what appeared to be increasingly difficult phone calls and video conferences. As he quietly began emptying the nearby wastebaskets, Edward couldn't help but overhear fragments of Taylor's conversations. He wasn't eavesdropping intentionally. The open office layout made privacy nearly impossible, but the pieces he'd gathered painted a picture of someone fighting battles on multiple fronts. There had been the hushed phone calls to someone named Rebecca about extending the payment plan and just needing a little more time. Then there were the work-related conversations that grew more heated each week, discussions about budget cuts, account losses, and the kind of corporate restructuring that usually meant people would be losing their jobs. Edward understood that kind of pressure. 3 years ago, he'd been on the other side of similar conversations. Before his life had taken its unexpected turn, he'd been a financial analyst at Hartwell & Associates, complete with his own corner office, a six-figure salary, and the kind of confidence that came from climbing the corporate ladder. But when his wife Jessica had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, everything had changed in an instant. The medical bills came first, treatments not covered by insurance, experimental procedures, trips to specialists in other cities. Then had come the time away from work, the missed deadlines, the gradual erosion of her professional reputation as he chose his family over his career. When Jessica passed away after a 2-year battle, Edward found himself a widowed single father to 8-year-old Danny with mounting debt and a resume that had too many gaps to explain easily. The transition from financial analyst to night janitor hadn't been part of any life plan, but it had been necessary. The job provided health insurance for Danny, steady if modest income, and most importantly, a schedule that allowed him to be home when his son woke up for school and available for homework help in the afternoons. Edward had learned to find dignity in honest work, even if it meant starting over at the bottom of the economic ladder. Now, watching Taylor Smith struggle with what appeared to be her own version of a life falling apart, Edward felt a familiar recognition. He saw the same desperate determination he'd once felt, the same refusal to give up, even when everything seemed to be working against you. But he also saw something else, the dangerous isolation that came from trying to handle everything alone. Over the months, Edward had noticed the small details that others missed. The way Taylor had switched from bringing lunch from expensive restaurants to brown-bagging simple sandwiches. The expensive coffee habit that had been replaced with the office break room's bitter brew. The designer handbag that had been replaced with a more practical tote bag. Most telling of all, he'd observed the increasing number of tissues on her desk and the way she would quickly compose herself whenever someone entered her office. Edward had been in corporate America long enough to recognize the signs of someone hanging on by a thread, trying to maintain the appearance of success while everything crumbled behind the scenes. He'd lived that reality himself, and he knew how lonely and overwhelming it could feel. As he continued his cleaning routine, moving methodically through the department, Edward found himself wondering about Taylor's story. What circumstances had led to this obvious financial strain? Was she supporting family members, dealing with medical bills, facing a divorce? The possibilities were endless, but the stress was unmistakable. The sound of Taylor's chair pushing back from her desk caught Edward's attention. Through the glass partition, he watched as she stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city lights of Northbridge. Even from his position across the department, he could see the slump in her shoulders, the way she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold everything together. Edward had been carrying tissues in his uniform pocket for weeks now, telling himself it was just practical preparation for the building's air conditioning system that always seemed to trigger allergies. But deep down, he knew he'd been preparing for a moment like this. A moment when someone who had shown him basic human dignity might need the same kindness returned. The decision, when it came, felt both spontaneous and inevitable. Edward quietly set down his cleaning supplies and walked toward Taylor's office, the package of tissues feeling strangely heavy in his pocket. He'd been watching her struggle for months, and tonight something told him it was time to stop being invisible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The corporate world of Meridian Dynamics was unforgiving, and Taylor Smith knew she was running out of time. As senior marketing manager, she was responsible for a portfolio worth $12 million in annual revenue, but 3 major clients had already jumped ship this quarter, and the whispers about layoffs were getting louder every day. What made it worse was the personal crisis she was hiding from everyone. Her younger sister Emma's medical bills were drowning them both, and Taylor had been secretly liquidating everything she owned to keep Emma's treatments going. Taylor's corner office on the 14th floor had once been her pride and joy. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Northbridge City's financial district, a mahogany desk that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and walls lined with awards from her 7-year climb up the corporate ladder. She'd earned every square foot of this space through 60-hour weeks, brilliant campaign strategies, and the kind of ruthless ambition that had made her the youngest senior marketing manager in Meridian Dynamics' 40-year history. But tonight, staring at the city lights that used to inspire her, Taylor felt like she was watching her entire world crumble in slow motion. The leather portfolio on her desk contained documents that told the story of her descent: client termination letters, budget revision demands from her supervisor Marcus Pemberton, and most damning of all, a performance improvement plan that was essentially a countdown to termination. The Hartwell Industries account had been the first domino to fall 6 months ago. $28 million in annual billings gone because their new CEO wanted to take the marketing in-house. Then came Westfield Corporation, a $15 million loss that Taylor had fought desperately to prevent, even offering to cut her commission by half. The final blow had been Ocean View Resorts last month, her oldest and most trusted client relationship, destroyed by a competitor's bid that came in 40% lower than anything Taylor could possibly match. Marcus Pemberton, her supervisor and the vice president of client relations, had made it clear that her position was in jeopardy. "The market's tough, Taylor," he'd said during their last review meeting, his voice carrying that particular brand of corporate sympathy that preceded termination. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody at Meridian Dynamics knew, was that Taylor's professional struggles were only half the battle. The real crisis was happening at Northbridge General Hospital, where her 24-year-old sister Emma was fighting acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Emma had been diagnosed 8 months ago, just as she was finishing her master's degree in education. The treatments were aggressive and expensive, and while their parents had helped initially, their modest retirement savings had been depleted within the first 3 months. Emma's insurance covered the basic treatments, but the experimental therapies that offered the best hope for remission cost nearly $8,000 per month, money that neither Emma nor their parents had. Taylor had stepped in without hesitation, liquidating her investment portfolio, cashing out her 401k despite the penalties, and eventually taking out a second mortgage on her downtown condo. She'd sold her BMW and bought a used Honda Civic, canceled her gym membership and subscription services, and started shopping at discount stores instead of the boutiques she'd frequented during her more prosperous days. The financial strain was crushing, but the emotional weight was even heavier. Emma didn't know the full extent of Taylor's sacrifices. She thought their parents were covering most of the costs, and Taylor intended to keep it that way. Emma needed to focus on getting better, not worry about the financial devastation her illness was causing. Every evening, after the long hours at Meridian Dynamics, Taylor would drive across town to the hospital for visiting hours. She'd sit beside Emma's bed, holding her sister's hand and pretending that everything was fine, that the job was going great, that the treatments were just a temporary setback before Emma could start her teaching career. But the truth was that Taylor was drowning. The experimental treatment costs were increasing, and her latest credit card applications had been denied. She'd already borrowed against her condo to its maximum equity, and her savings account showed a balance that wouldn't cover next month's treatment. Worse yet, the performance improvement plan at work meant she was essentially on a 90-day countdown to unemployment. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was fighting to keep clients worth millions of dollars while unable to afford her own family's medical bills. Every strategy meeting, every client presentation, every campaign proposal was now tinged with the desperate awareness that her paycheck was the only thing standing between Emma and discontinued treatment. Taylor had always prided herself on being independent, on solving problems through hard work and determination. She'd built her career by being the person others could depend on, the one who had all the answers and never let personal issues interfere with professional responsibilities. But now, for the first time in her adult life, she was facing problems that couldn't be solved through late nights and strategic thinking. The stress was beginning to show in ways she couldn't completely hide. The confident presentations that had once been her trademark now required extensive preparation to mask her anxiety. The quick wit and easy rapport with clients had been replaced by a more cautious, calculated approach that sometimes came across as distant or unfocused. Her assistant Rachel had started asking if she was feeling well, and her colleague David from the design department had mentioned that she seemed a little off lately. Most nights, Taylor found herself staying late at the office not just to catch up on work, but because the quiet of the empty building was the only place she could let her guard down. At home, she had to maintain the facade for Emma's sake during their daily phone calls. At the hospital, she needed to be the strong, optimistic sister who believed everything would work out. But here, surrounded by the familiar hum of office equipment and the distant sounds of the cleaning crew, she could finally acknowledge how scared and overwhelmed she really was. The cleaning crew had become an unexpected source of comfort during these long evenings. Unlike her colleagues who might ask questions or offer unwanted advice, the janitors went about their work with professional discretion. There was something oddly soothing about the routine sounds of their work. The gentle whoosh of vacuum cleaners, the quiet clink of supplies being organized, the soft footsteps of people who understand the value of not disturbing others. One janitor in particular had caught her attention over the past few months. An older man with kind eyes who always nodded politely when their paths crossed, who seemed to time his cleaning schedule to avoid interrupting her work, and who had a gentle presence that somehow made the late evening hours feel less lonely. She'd noticed his name tag read Edward, and while they'd never had more than brief exchanges of good evening and have a good night, there was something about his quiet dignity that reminded her of her father. Tonight, as Taylor stood at her office window watching the city lights blur through tears she couldn't quite suppress, she wondered how much longer she could keep all the pieces of her life from falling apart. Emma's next treatment was scheduled for Friday, and Taylor's bank account wouldn't cover it. The Meridian Dynamics quarterly review was next week, and she still didn't have any new client prospects to present. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice was beginning to whisper the thought she'd been trying to avoid. What if she couldn't save her sister? What if, despite all her sacrifices and determination, it simply wasn't enough? The sound of the cleaning cart in the hallway pulled Taylor back to the present moment. Through her office's glass partition, she could see Edward methodically working his way through the department, the same quiet efficiency she'd observed for months. There was something reassuring about his presence, about the way he went about his work with focus and purpose, as if finding dignity in every task regardless of how others might perceive it. But the most powerful testimony came from people who had no financial stake in the outcome. Dr. Sarah Kim, the neurologist who diagnosed Madeline's condition, explained that early-stage Huntington's disease typically didn't affect executive function or business judgment. If anything, she testified, many patients experienced a period of enhanced focus and determination as they worked to accomplish important goals before their symptoms progressed. Ms. Smith's decision to establish a succession plan while she's still cognitively intact represents exactly the kind of responsible long-term planning that we encourage in patients with progressive neurological conditions, Dr. Kim told the court. Far from indicating impaired judgment, these actions demonstrate exceptional foresight and moral clarity. The breakthrough came on the trial's 7th day, when Alexandra Smith took the witness stand with the composed authority of someone who'd inherited her mother's steel spine along with her business empire. At 17, she was technically a minor, but her testimony carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what was at stake for the community she'd grown up loving. Pinnacle keeps talking about maximizing asset value, she said, looking directly at Richard Blackstone as she spoke. But they're missing the point. Silver Peak Resort isn't just a business, it's a community. The employee housing they want to eliminate isn't inefficient overhead, it's what allows families like the Chens and the Morrisons to raise their children in a place where they can afford to live. She pulled out a folder of documents that her legal team had prepared, spreading financial projections across the witness table with the confidence of someone who'd been studying business principles since middle school. Under Mr. Ruiz's management, mountain safety incidents have decreased by 60%, while guest satisfaction scores have increased to the highest levels in the resort's history. Employee turnover has dropped to virtually zero, which saves approximately $200,000 annually in recruitment and training costs. These aren't the results of incompetent management, they're the results of management that understands what actually creates value in hospitality operations. But it was what happened outside the courtroom that ultimately decided the case. Local news coverage of the trial had attracted attention from tourism industry publications, environmental groups, and labor organizations who saw Silver Peak's community-focused policies as a model for sustainable mountain development. Letters of support poured in from guests who'd been visiting the resort for decades, former employees who'd built careers elsewhere but remembered the values they'd learned at Silver Peak, and business leaders who understood that long-term profitability required more than short-term cost-cutting. The decisive moment came when Colorado's Lieutenant Governor, Rebecca Martinez, submitted a formal statement supporting Silver Peak's current management structure. She described the resort as a showcase for how responsible business practices can create economic prosperity while strengthening mountain communities, and noted that the state had been studying Silver Peak's employee benefit programs as a model for legislation encouraging sustainable tourism development. On the trial's final day, Judge Patricia Hawkins delivered a ruling that felt like vindication for everyone who'd believed that community values and business success weren't mutually exclusive. She rejected Pinnacle's petition for judicial review, finding that Madeline's succession planning represented sound business judgment exercised by someone with full cognitive capacity, and that the resort's financial performance under its current policies provided no evidence of management incompetence. Furthermore, Judge Hawkins continued, "This court finds that the operational transition executed by Silver Peak Resort demonstrates exactly the kind of responsible leadership development that should be encouraged in family-owned businesses facing succession challenges. Mr. Ruiz and his management team have proven their competence through results, not credentials." The celebration that followed felt like a community festival rather than a legal victory. Outside the courthouse, Raymond found himself surrounded by resort employees who'd driven down from Winter Haven to witness the verdict, local business owners who'd been following the case through media coverage, and advocacy groups who saw the ruling as a precedent for protecting worker-friendly policies against corporate pressure. But the moment that mattered most came when Camila broke away from Victoria's supervision and launched herself into his arms with the force of someone who'd been worried about outcomes she was too young to fully understand. "Did we win, Daddy?" she asked, her face bright with the kind of relief that children felt when adult problems were finally resolved in ways that preserved their sense of security. "We won, Mija," Raymond said, holding her close while looking over her head at Madeline, who was accepting congratulations from the legal team with tears streaming down her face. "We all won." As they prepared for the drive back to Winter Haven and the mountain community that had fought so hard to protect itself, Raymond realized that the real victory wasn't the legal ruling or the financial security or even the preservation of jobs and benefits. The real victory was the proof that when people were willing to risk everything for each other, they could overcome forces that seemed impossibly powerful. Sometimes saving one person from an avalanche really could lead to saving an entire community from destruction. Sometimes courage was contagious, and sometimes the most important battles were won by ordinary people who refused to accept that ordinary people couldn't win them. 1 year later, Raymond stood on the deck of the Mountain Safety Command Center watching the first snowfall of the season dust the peaks of Silver Peak Resort with the promise of another winter that would test everything they'd built together. The view from his office hadn't changed, but everything else about his life had transformed in ways that still sometimes left him breathless with gratitude and responsibility in equal measure.
"I'll have an answer for you by Friday morning," Taylor said firmly. "I need to figure out the financial logistics, but if there's a chance this could save her, Then I have to try." After she hung up, Taylor remained standing at the window for several minutes, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Edward could see her shoulders shaking slightly, and he realized she was crying. Not the controlled, professional tears she'd been managing for months, but the kind of desperate, exhausted sobbing that came from someone who'd reached the absolute limit of what they could endure alone. It was in that moment that Edward made his decision. He'd been carrying tissues for weeks, telling himself he was just being prepared, but now he understood why. Some moments demanded action, regardless of social conventions or professional boundaries. Taylor Smith had shown him basic human dignity during the darkest period of his own life, treating him as a person rather than invisible help. Now she was facing the same impossible choices he'd faced with Jessica, and he couldn't stand by and watch her suffer alone. Edward quietly set down his cleaning supplies and walked toward Taylor's office, his footsteps soft on the carpeted floor. He knocked gently on her doorframe, waiting for her to notice his presence before speaking. Taylor turned from the window, quickly wiping her eyes and attempting to compose herself. "Oh, Edward, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were still here. I can get out of your way if you need to clean." "Ma'am," Edward said quietly, pulling the package of tissues from his pocket. "I think you might need these." Taylor stared at the tissues for a moment, then looked up at Edward's face. There was something in his expression, not pity but understanding, that made her defenses crumble completely. She accepted the tissues with trembling hands, and when she looked up at him again, Edward saw the same desperate exhaustion he'd felt during those long nights in hospital waiting rooms. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. Edward hesitated for a moment, then stepped slightly closer. "Ma'am, I don't mean to overstep, but I've been working this floor for 3 years, and I've noticed you've been having a real hard time lately. I couldn't help but overhear tonight's call, and I want you to know that you're not as alone as you might think." Taylor's eyes widened in surprise, both at his words and at the gentle dignity in his voice. For months, Edward had been a quiet, respectful presence in the background of her crisis, but now he was stepping forward as a human being who'd witnessed her struggle and chose to acknowledge it rather than pretend he hadn't seen. Taylor started, then stopped, unsure how to respond to this unexpected moment of connection with someone she'd never really considered as anything more than part of the building's maintenance staff. "I've been watching you fight for months," Edward continued, his voice steady and kind. "I've seen how hard you've been working, how much you've been carrying by yourself. And tonight, listening to that call, I realized something that I think you need to hear." Taylor clutched the tissues, waiting for whatever revelation this quiet janitor was about to share. In her exhausted, desperate state, she was open to wisdom from any source, even if it came from the most unexpected place. "What I realized," Edward said, his eyes meeting her with unexpected intensity, "is that everything I've been watching you go through, all the sacrifices and the late nights and the impossible choices, I've seen it all before. Because 3 years ago, I was standing exactly where you are now." Edward's words hung in the air between them like a bridge that had suddenly appeared across an impossible chasm. Taylor stared at him, tissues forgotten in her hand, trying to process what this quiet janitor had just revealed. In her exhausted state, his statement felt both impossible and somehow perfectly logical. Of course the universe would place someone who understood her situation directly in her path, disguised as part of the building's invisible workforce. "You were where I am now?" Taylor's voice was barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had made this man step out of the shadows of her peripheral vision and into the center of her crisis. Edward nodded slowly, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that somehow conveyed both respect and solidarity. 3 years ago, I was wearing a very different uniform. Suits, ties, corner office 2 floors up in the Hartwell building across the street. I was a senior financial analyst, pulling down 6 figures, had my whole life mapped out in 5-year plans. Taylor's eyes widened slightly. She'd never really looked at Edward, truly looked at him, but now she could see something in his bearing, a quiet confidence that spoke of education and experience far beyond what her current position might suggest. The way he spoke, his vocabulary, even his posture suggested someone who'd navigated professional environments before. My wife, Jessica, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer when our son Danny was 6, Edward continued, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of old pain that Taylor recognized immediately. Stage 4. The doctors gave her 18 months, maybe 2 years with aggressive treatment. Taylor felt her breath catch. The parallel was too precise, too familiar. She found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into Edward's story despite the impossibility of this conversation happening at 10:30 p.m. in her corporate office with a man she'd never spoken to for more than 30 seconds. The treatments weren't covered by insurance, Edward said, moving slightly closer but maintaining a respectful distance. Experimental protocols, specialized medications, trips to treatment centers in other states. Sound familiar?
"How much?" Taylor asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Everything," Edward replied simply. "Our savings, my retirement account, a second mortgage on the house, credit cards maxed out, loans against my life insurance policy. By the time Jessica died, I'd liquidated 23 years of careful financial planning." Taylor's hand went to her throat. The number wasn't as important as the totality of it. Edward had done exactly what she was doing, had made the same impossible choice to sacrifice everything for someone he loved. But unlike her situation, his story had already reached its conclusion. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the professional condolences sounding inadequate in the face of what Edward had just shared. "The money was the least of it," Edward continued, though not dismissively. "The real cost was the time away from work, the missed deadlines, the colleagues who couldn't understand why I wasn't managing my personal situation more effectively. My performance reviews started slipping. I was passed over for a promotion I'd been working toward for 3 years. Eventually, I had to choose between keeping my job and being there for Jessica during her final months." Taylor felt a chill of recognition. She'd been having the same internal battle for months, trying to balance Emma's needs with the demands of her career, watching her professional reputation slowly erode as personal crisis consumed her energy and focus. "You chose Jessica," Taylor said. "Not really a question." "I chose Jessica," Edward confirmed. "And when she died, I found myself a single father with a mountain of debt, gaps in my resume that were impossible to explain in interviews, and references who'd watched me lose focus during the most important period of my career." "So you ended up here," Taylor said, gesturing around the corporate environment that surrounded them. "I ended up here," Edward agreed, but without any trace of bitterness or self-pity. "Night janitor at Riverside Corporate Plaza, health insurance for Danny, steady paycheck, and a schedule that lets me be home when he gets up for school and help with homework in the afternoons." Taylor studied Edward's face, looking for signs of regret or resentment, but found only a kind of peaceful acceptance that seemed impossible given what he'd lost. "Do you ever regret it, the choice to give up your career for Jessica?" Edward was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret that the system is set up to make people choose between taking care of their families and maintaining their financial security. I regret that health insurance doesn't cover the treatments that actually give people hope. I regret that 3 years of fighting for Jessica's life meant I couldn't provide Danny with the stability he needed during the most traumatic period of his childhood." He paused, looking directly at Taylor with an intensity that made her feel like he was seeing straight through to her soul. "But I don't regret a single dollar I spent, a single day I missed work, or a single moment I got to spend with Jessica before she died. Because at the end, when she was lying in that hospital bed, she wasn't thinking about my career prospects or our credit score. She was thinking about the fact that I'd chosen her, that she wasn't alone, and that love had been more important than money." Taylor felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but this time they felt different, less desperate, more like relief. For months, she'd been carrying the weight of her choices alone, second-guessing every financial sacrifice,
wondering if she was destroying her future for a hope that might not materialize. But hearing Edward's story, seeing the peace in his eyes despite everything he'd lost, gave her a perspective she hadn't been able to find on her own. "The experimental treatment in Switzerland," Edward said quietly, apparently having heard more of her phone conversation than she'd realized. $45,000. Taylor nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. "Do you have access to that kind of money?" Edward asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I have maybe $12,000 left in available credit," admitted. "I could potentially get another $15,000 if I sell my condo, but that would take weeks, and Dr. Patterson said we need to start the treatment within 10 days to have any chance of success." Edward was quiet for several moments, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was about to share something significant. "Taylor," he said, using her name for the first time, "I need to tell you something else about the past 3 years. Something about what I've been doing during the quiet hours of these night shifts, and why I've been watching your situation so carefully." Taylor looked up expectantly, sensing that whatever Edward was about to reveal would be just as surprising as learning about his previous career and personal tragedy. "You see, losing everything taught me something important about money and resources and the way opportunities present themselves. It taught me to pay attention to patterns, to notice when someone else is walking the same path I walked, and to recognize when I might be in a position to help." "What do you mean?" Taylor asked, though something in Edward's tone was making her heart beat faster with a hope she didn't dare to fully acknowledge. Edward reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "For the past 3 years, I've been documenting every conversation I've overheard, every detail I've observed about the financial struggles of people in this building. Not to invade privacy, but because I learned that sometimes the solution to one person's problem is sitting right in front of them, if someone is paying attention to the bigger picture." He opened the notebook and showed Taylor pages covered with careful handwriting, dates, names, observations, and what looked like financial calculations. "Taylor," Edward said, his voice gentle but filled with unmistakable certainty, "I know exactly how to get Emma the money she needs for that treatment in Switzerland. But first, you need to understand that everything you think you know about your situation is about to change." Taylor stared at the worn notebook in Edward's hands, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. The careful handwriting, the dates, the financial calculations. It looked like the work of someone who'd been conducting a detailed investigation, not the casual observations of a night janitor. "I don't understand," Taylor said slowly, her voice hoarse from crying. "What kind of conversations? What bigger picture?" Edward flipped through several pages of his notebook, each one filled with meticulous notes that looked more like a financial analyst's research than anything Taylor would have expected from their previous interactions. 3 years of cleaning offices gives you access to information that most people don't realize they're sharing, he said quietly. Phone calls made after hours, documents left on desks, conversations held in supposedly empty conference rooms. Taylor felt a chill of unease mixed with curiosity. "You've been listening to private conversations?" "I've been impossible not to hear them," Edward corrected gently. "But more importantly, I've been recognizing patterns that the people having those conversations can't see because they're too close to their own situations." He turned to a specific page in his notebook, one that Taylor could see was labeled with her name at the top. Her stomach dropped as she realized Edward had been documenting her crisis in detail. "May I?" Edward asked, gesturing to the chair across from Taylor's desk. Taylor nodded mutely, watching as Edward sat down with the careful dignity she'd observed in him for months. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his eyes, the way he carried himself with quiet authority despite the janitor's uniform. "Taylor, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me," Edward began, opening his notebook to her page. "Your sister Emma isn't just fighting leukemia. She's fighting a disease that's been deliberately understudied and underfunded because there's more money in managing chronic illness than in curing it. Taylor's eyebrows furrowed. What do you mean, deliberately understudied? Edward pulled out several printed pages from the back of his notebook, research articles, financial reports, and what looked like internal pharmaceutical company documents. The experimental treatment Dr. Patterson mentioned in Switzerland? It's not experimental because it's new. It's experimental because Meridian Pharmaceutical, the company that developed it, has been deliberately limiting access to keep prices artificially high. Meridian Pharmaceutical? Taylor's voice was sharp with recognition. That's one of our clients. We handle their North American marketing campaigns. Exactly, Edward said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that suggested they'd reached an important revelation. And what you don't know, what Marcus Pemberton has been very careful not to share with you, is that Meridian Pharmaceutical has been pressuring your company to suppress information about the Swiss treatment's success rates. Taylor felt the world tilt slightly around her. That's impossible. Marcus would have told me if there was a conflict of interest with one of our pharmaceutical clients. Edward turned his notebook to show her a page covered with dates, times, and detailed notes. October 15th, 9:47 p.m. Marcus Pemberton, conference call with Dr. Heinrich Mueller from the Zurich Treatment Center. Quote, "We need to ensure that information about success rates doesn't reach American patients until we can establish domestic treatment centers at premium pricing." Taylor's hands began to shake as she read Edward's careful handwriting. The date is 3 weeks ago, right around the time Dr. Patterson had first mentioned the Swiss treatment as a last resort option. October 22nd, 8:23 p.m., Edward continued, reading from his notes. Marcus Pemberton, phone call with Meridian Pharmaceuticals head of strategic development. Quote, "The Smith situation could become a problem if she starts researching alternative treatments. Her sister's case profile is exactly the type that would benefit from the Swiss protocol." "The Smith situation," Taylor repeated, her voice hollow with shock. "He was talking about me, about Emma." November 3rd, 10:15 p.m., Edward read on. Marcus Pemberton, conference call with Meridian's legal department. Quote, "If Taylor Smith's sister accesses the Swiss treatment and achieves remission, it could create a precedent that undermines our domestic pricing strategy. We need to ensure she doesn't have the financial resources to pursue that option." Taylor stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward into the wall. "You're telling me that Marcus, my supervisor, has been actively working to prevent Emma from getting treatment that could save her life?" Edward nodded grimly. "Not just preventing, orchestrating. The client losses you've experienced over the past 6 months? The Hartwell Industries account, Westfield Corporation, Ocean View Resorts? What about them?" Taylor asked, though her heart was already racing with the terrible certainty that she was about to learn something that would change everything. "Marcus arranged for those clients to receive better offers from competing firms," Edward said, his voice gentle despite the devastating nature of his revelation. "Not because your work wasn't excellent, but because keeping you financially desperate was essential to ensuring Emma couldn't access the Swiss treatment." Taylor sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. "You're saying my own supervisor has been sabotaging my career to prevent my sister from getting medical treatment?"
I'm saying that Meridian Pharmaceutical has millions of dollars invested in domestic treatment facilities that become worthless if patients can access more effective treatments abroad, Edward explained. And Marcus Pemberton has been receiving substantial consulting fees to ensure that case studies like Emma don't create inconvenient precedents. Edward pulled out another document from his notebook, a bank statement copy that made Taylor's eyes widen in shock. Marcus received a $47,000 consulting fee from Meridian Pharmaceutical on October 30th, the same day your Ocean View Resorts account was terminated. $47,000? Taylor whispered. "That's more than enough to cover Emma's treatment." That's not a coincidence, Edward said quietly. The fee was calculated specifically to match the cost of the Swiss treatment, plus travel expenses. It was meant to be a symbolic reminder of what Marcus was helping to prevent. Taylor felt nauseous as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. For months, she'd been blaming herself for losing clients, questioning her abilities, working increasingly desperate hours to try to save her career. Meanwhile, the man she reported to had been systematically undermining her to protect a pharmaceutical company's profit margins. "How do you know all this?" Taylor asked, her voice barely steady. "How did you get access to bank statements and internal company documents?" Edward was quiet for a moment, then closed his notebook and looked directly at Taylor. "Because Marcus Pemberton isn't as careful about his private phone calls as he thinks he is. And because 3 years ago, when I was a financial analyst at Hartwell & Associates, one of my specialties was investigating corporate fraud and financial manipulation." "You investigated corporate fraud?" Taylor's voice rose with surprise. "I specialized in cases where pharmaceutical companies manipulated market access to maintain pricing advantages. I know how to recognize the patterns, how to trace the financial relationships, and how to document evidence that would stand up in court." Taylor stared at Edward with new understanding. "You've been building a case." "I've been building multiple cases. Meridian Pharmaceutical isn't just manipulating Emma's treatment access. They've been systematically preventing dozens of patients from accessing effective treatments while charging premium prices for less effective domestic alternatives." Edward pulled out one final document from his notebook, a thick folder marked with official-looking letterhead. "Which is why tomorrow morning the Federal Trade Commission is going to receive a comprehensive report documenting Meridian Pharmaceuticals' anti-competitive practices, including detailed evidence of their collaboration with Marcus Pemberton to manipulate patient access to treatment." Taylor's heart began beating faster. "What does that mean for Emma?" "It means," Edward said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 3 years carefully planning this moment, "that by Friday afternoon, Meridian Pharmaceutical is going to be very motivated to provide Emma with free access to the Swiss treatment, along with substantial compensation for the deliberate delays in her care." Free access? Taylor could barely process what she was hearing. How was that possible? Edward smiled for the first time since their conversation began, and Taylor could see a glimmer of the sharp financial analyst he'd once been. Because the alternative, a federal investigation into their practices, plus a class action lawsuit from dozens of families who've been denied treatment, would cost them approximately $50 million in fines and settlements. And you have evidence to support all of this. "I have 3 years' worth of recorded conversations, copied documents, financial records, and witness testimony," Edward said, patting his notebook. "Plus the cooperation of 6 other patients whose families have been similarly manipulated." Taylor felt tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of relief mixed with overwhelming gratitude. "Edward, why would you do this? Why would you risk everything to help Emma?" Edward's expression softened, and for a moment he looked less like a strategic mastermind and more like the grieving widower who'd lost everything to save his wife. "Because 3 years ago, when I was where you are now, no one was paying attention to the bigger picture. No one noticed that the system was rigged against families like mine. I lost Jessica, but I learned how the game really works." He leaned forward slightly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Emma doesn't have to die so that Meridian Pharmaceutical can maintain their profit margins. And you don't have to choose between your career and your family, because the choice you think you're making isn't real. It's been manufactured by people who profit from your desperation." Taylor looked at this man who'd been invisible to her for months, who'd been quietly documenting the conspiracy that was destroying her life while she struggled alone with impossible choices. "When do we start?" Edward checked his watch, 11:47 p.m., and then looked back at Taylor with the focused intensity of someone shifting into operational mode. "We start now, but first you need to understand that once we begin this process, there's no going back. Meridian Pharmaceutical and Marcus have powerful legal teams, and they won't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens their operation." Taylor felt a surge of determination that surprised her with its strength. After months of feeling helpless, the possibility of fighting back, of actually having weapons to use against the forces that had been crushing her, was intoxicating. "What do you need me to do?" Edward pulled out his phone and opened what appeared to be a secure messaging app. "The first thing we need is proof that Marcus has been deliberately sabotaging your client relationships. I have his phone conversations, but we need evidence that shows the direct connection between his actions and your account losses."
"I have access to all the client termination files," Taylor said, her mind already racing through the possibilities. Contract details, termination reasons, competing bid information. If Marcus was involved in arranging better offers for other firms, there would be traces in the documentation. "Exactly," Edward confirmed. "But we need to be strategic about how we access that information. If Marcus realizes we're investigating him, he'll have time to cover his tracks and warn Meridian Pharmaceutical." Edward opened his notebook to a page that looked like a detailed timeline. "According to my observations, Marcus typically leaves the office around 7 p.m., but he returns most nights between 11 p.m. and midnight to make his private calls to Meridian Pharmaceutical. He uses the conference room on the 16th floor because he thinks it's more secure." Taylor's eyes widened. "He's here now?" "Probably," Edward said, checking his watch again, "which gives us a window of opportunity. His office is locked, but his computer auto-logs him out after 30 minutes of inactivity. If we can access his workstation while he's upstairs making his calls, we might be able to find the internal communications that prove his involvement." "That's breaking and entering," Taylor pointed out, though her tone suggested she was considering it rather than rejecting it. "It's accessing your own company's files using your legitimate employee credentials. Marcus's office is in the same department where you have authorized access. The only question is whether you're willing to take the risk." Taylor thought about Emma lying in a hospital bed, about the $45,000 treatment that represented her sister's only hope for survival, about the months of financial devastation that had been deliberately orchestrated by the man she trusted as her supervisor. What's the plan? Edward stood up and moved to Taylor's office window, looking up toward the 16th floor. "There's a light on in conference room B. That's where Marcus makes his private calls. If we're quiet, we can get to his office, access his computer, and copy the files we need before he finishes his conversation." "How do you know so much about his routines?" Taylor asked, though she was already grabbing her access badge and following Edward toward the door. 3 years of night shifts gives you a comprehensive understanding of this building's after-hours activities. I know which executives work late, which ones have affairs, which ones conduct business they don't want on company servers, and which ones think the cleaning staff is invisible." They moved quickly but quietly through the empty corridors, Edward leading the way with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the building. Taylor found herself studying his movements, noting the strategic way he avoided the areas covered by security cameras and the practiced silence of his footsteps. "Edward," she whispered, as they approached the elevator, "what did you do before you were a financial analyst?" "Army intelligence," Edward replied, without breaking stride. 2 tours in Afghanistan, specializing in financial warfare and corporate espionage. It's how I learned to trace money through complex networks and identify patterns in seemingly unrelated transactions." Taylor felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Edward wasn't just a grieving widower who'd happened to notice her struggles. He was a trained investigator with military experience in exactly the kind of operations they were about to undertake. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent, both of them focused on what they were about to attempt. When the doors opened, Edward held up a hand, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate Marcus's location. Conference room B is at the far end of the hallway. Marcus's office is 3 doors down from the elevator. We'll have maybe 15 minutes before he finishes his conversation. Marcus Pemberton's office was exactly what Taylor would have expected. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, walls lined with awards and photographs showing him with various pharmaceutical executives. But what caught her attention was the computer screen, still glowing with what appeared to be a Meridian Pharmaceutical internal portal. He didn't log out, Taylor breathed, moving quickly toward the desk. Edward positioned himself near the door, keeping watch while Taylor navigated through Marcus's files. Look for anything labeled strategic accounts, client transition, or competitive positioning, he advised quietly. Taylor's fingers flew over the keyboard, her years of corporate experience helping her navigate the file structure efficiently. What she found made her stomach clench with anger and disgust. "Edward, look at this," she whispered, pointing to a folder labeled Smith Account Management. Inside were detailed files on her major clients, including internal Meridian Pharmaceutical communications about market manipulation strategies and controlled account transfers. "Download everything," Edward instructed, pulling out a USB drive. "We need copies of the entire folder structure." As the files transferred, Taylor continued exploring Marcus's computer. She found email chains between Marcus and Meridian executives discussing the Smith problem, detailed financial projections showing how Emma's successful treatment would impact their domestic market share, and most damning of all, a signed consulting agreement that paid Marcus a percentage of revenue protected through patient access management. "This is incredible," Taylor whispered, scrolling through months of communications. "They've been planning this for almost a year. Look at this email from last December. They identified Emma as a high-risk case study because her age and cancer type made her an ideal candidate for the Swiss treatment." Edward glanced at the screen while maintaining his watch at the door. "Print the most damaging documents. We need hard copies in case they try to delete the digital files." Taylor sent several key documents to the office printer, the soft whirring sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet building. As the pages emerged, she could see the full scope of what had been done to her family. Deliberate, calculated, and motivated entirely by corporate greed.
"We need to go," Edward said suddenly, hearing footsteps in the distant hallway. "Marcus is finishing his call." Taylor grabbed the printed documents and the USB drive, quickly closing all the open files and returning Marcus's computer to its original state. They moved swiftly toward the emergency stairwell, avoiding the elevator that might announce their presence. As they descended to the 14th floor, Taylor's mind was racing with the implications of what they'd discovered. "Edward, this evidence, it's enough to destroy Marcus and potentially bring down Meridian Pharmaceuticals' entire patient manipulation program." "It's enough to save Emma," Edward confirmed. "But we need to be strategic about how we use it. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to contact the federal investigators who've been building their own case against Meridian Pharmaceutical. Your evidence will be the missing piece they need to move forward with criminal charges." Back in Taylor's office, Edward spread the printed documents across her desk like a general planning a battle. "Here's what's going to happen over the next 48 hours, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd planned complex operations before. "First, I'm going to submit our evidence package to the Federal Trade Commission and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Second, you're going to call Dr. Patterson and tell him to prepare Emma for immediate transport to Switzerland. Third, we're going to give Marcus and Meridian Pharmaceutical an opportunity to do the right thing before the federal hammer falls." "What do you mean, give them an opportunity?" Taylor asked. Edward smiled, and for the first time Taylor could see the strategic mind that had once analyzed financial crimes for a living. "Tomorrow afternoon, you're going to walk into Marcus's office and present him with copies of everything we found. You're going to explain that he has 24 hours to arrange full funding for Emma's treatment, plus compensation for the financial damage he's caused your family. And if he refuses, then Thursday morning, federal agents will be executing search warrants on both his office and Meridian Pharmaceuticals' headquarters. Marcus is smart enough to realize that cooperation is his only chance of avoiding federal prison." Taylor looked at the evidence spread across her desk. Months of deliberate manipulation, corporate conspiracy, and calculated cruelty that had nearly cost Emma her life. But now, instead of feeling helpless, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the power to fight back. "Edward," she said quietly, "how can I ever thank you for this?
Edward began gathering the documents, his expression thoughtful. By making sure Emma gets to start that teaching job she's been planning. By showing Marcus and Meridian Pharmaceutical that families like ours aren't disposable. And by helping me ensure that no other family has to go through what you've been through. What do you mean, helping you? Edward looked up from the documents, his eyes carrying a determination that Taylor was beginning to recognize as the driving force behind everything he'd done for the past 3 years. This isn't just about Emma, Taylor. This is about dismantling a system that profits from human desperation. And tomorrow, we're going to begin the process of making sure that system never destroys another family. Edward and Taylor worked through the night, transforming her office into a command center for what was rapidly becoming the most complex operation of Edward's post-military career. By 3 a.m., they had organized the evidence into multiple packages, one for federal investigators, one for medical authorities, and one for the media contacts Edward had cultivated during his years of careful investigation. But what neither of them anticipated was how quickly word would begin to spread through the networks of families who'd been fighting similar battles in isolation. Taylor's phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m. with a text from an unknown number. "Heard you might have information about Meridian Pharmaceutical treatment access issues. My daughter is in the same situation as your sister. Can we talk? Rebecca Martinez, room 314, Northbridge General." "How did they find out?" Taylor asked, showing Edward the message. Edward looked up from his laptop where he'd been coordinating with federal investigators since 4 a.m. "I may have reached out to a few families last night, the ones whose situations I've been documenting alongside yours." "How many families?" 17, Edward admitted. "All with family members who would benefit from the Swiss treatment, all being systematically priced out by Meridian Pharmaceuticals' domestic pricing strategy." Taylor's phone buzzed again, then again. Within 20 minutes, she had received messages from 12 different families, all asking variations of the same question. Was there really a way to fight back against the system that was denying their loved ones access to life-saving treatment? "Edward, what have you done?" Taylor asked, though her tone was more amazed than concerned. "I've activated a network," Edward replied, pulling up a secure messaging platform on his laptop. "For 3 years, I've been documenting cases like yours, building relationships with families who felt completely alone in their struggles. Last night, I sent each of them a message explaining that we'd found a way to challenge Meridian Pharmaceuticals' practices." The scope of Edward's operation was becoming clear to Taylor for the first time. This wasn't just about saving Emma. It was about exposing a conspiracy that affected dozens of families, potentially hundreds of patients who were being denied access to effective treatments. "Look at this," Edward said, turning his laptop screen toward Taylor. The secure messaging platform showed a growing list of families sharing their experiences, their evidence, and their desperation for justice. "Maria Santos from Phoenix. My son Diego has been on the waiting list for the Swiss treatment for 8 months. His insurance company keeps finding new reasons to deny coverage." Dr. James Liu from Seattle. "As an oncologist, I've seen at least 20 patients who would benefit from the Swiss protocol. Every time I try to refer them, I'm told the treatment is experimental and not covered by insurance."
Patricia Williams from Dallas. "My husband's cancer responded initially to the Swiss treatment when we paid out of pocket, but we couldn't afford the full protocol. He died 3 months ago. If I'd known there was a conspiracy to keep prices artificially high." Taylor read message after message, each one representing a family that had been trapped in the same impossible situation she'd been facing. But now, instead of suffering in isolation, they were beginning to connect with each other, sharing information and building collective strength. "There's something else," Edward said, opening another folder on his laptop. "Dr. Sarah Chen at Johns Hopkins has been conducting her own investigation into Meridian Pharmaceuticals' practices. She's been trying to get FDA approval for domestic use of the Swiss protocol, but her applications keep getting buried in bureaucratic delays." "Another Dr. Chen?" Taylor asked, noting the familiar name. "Different Chen, no relation to my former colleague. But Dr. Sarah Chen has been documenting the same patterns we've discovered. She has clinical data showing that the Swiss treatment is not only more effective than Meridian's domestic alternatives, but also significantly less expensive to produce."
Edward pulled up Dr. Chen's research files, which painted a picture of systematic suppression of medical advancement in favor of corporate profit maximization. According to her calculations, if the Swiss protocol were available domestically at fair market prices, it would cost approximately $8,000 per patient instead of $45,000. $8,000? Taylor's voice rose with disbelief. They're charging more than 5 times what the treatment actually costs? The artificial pricing is created entirely through restricted access and regulatory manipulation. Dr. Chen has been trying to break through the barriers for 2 years, but every time she gets close to approval, new regulatory hurdles appear. Taylor's phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, she heard the voice of an older woman speaking with controlled urgency. "Miss Smith, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from Johns Hopkins. Edward Conklin contacted me about your sister's situation and the evidence you've gathered about Meridian Pharmaceuticals' practices." "Dr. Chen, thank you for calling," Taylor said, putting the phone on speaker so Edward could hear. "I need you to know that what you've discovered aligns perfectly with the investigation I've been conducting. But more importantly, I have information that could expedite your sister's treatment significantly." "What kind of information?" Taylor asked, her heart beginning to race. "The Swiss treatment protocol that Emma needs. I've been running an FDA-approved clinical trial of the same treatment here at Johns Hopkins for the past 6 months. The only reason patients haven't been able to access it is because Meridian Pharmaceutical has been using legal challenges to delay our final approval." Taylor felt the room spinning slightly. "You're saying Emma could receive the treatment in Baltimore instead of Switzerland?" "I'm saying Emma could start treatment this week at no cost to your family as part of our clinical trial. The only obstacle has been patient identification and intake, which Meridian Pharmaceutical has been systematically interfering with." Edward leaned toward the phone. "Dr. Chen, this is Edward Conklin. What kind of interference are we talking about?" "They've been monitoring hospital networks to identify potential trial candidates, then using their insurance industry connections to create coverage complications that make patients ineligible for enrollment." Taylor's anger was building to a level that surprised her with its intensity. So they've been watching Emma, knowing she could receive effective treatment, and deliberately preventing her from accessing it. "Not just Emma," Dr. Chan said. "We've identified at least 43 patients in the past year who were eligible for our trial but became ineligible due to what appeared to be coincidental insurance complications." Edward was already typing rapidly on his laptop. "Dr. Chen, would you be willing to provide testimony about these practices to federal investigators?" "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask me that question," Dr. Chen replied. "I have documentation of every interference incident, every suspicious insurance denial, and every patient who died while being denied access to treatment that could have saved their lives." Taylor's phone buzzed with another incoming call. The caller ID showed Northbridge General Hospital, Dr. Patterson. "Dr. Patterson," Taylor answered, her voice tight with anxiety about what new crisis might be developing. "Dr. Patterson, I need you to come to the hospital immediately," Dr. Patterson said, his voice carrying an unusual urgency. "Something extraordinary has happened with Emma's case, and I need to discuss treatment options with you in person." "What kind of something extraordinary?" Taylor asked, fear making her voice sharp. "The kind that suggests someone has been deliberately withholding information about treatment options from both of us. Emma's latest lab results show markers that indicate she would be an ideal candidate for a clinical trial I just learned about at Johns Hopkins, a trial that apparently has been accepting patients for months." Taylor looked at Edward, seeing her own amazement reflected in his eyes. The network Edward had activated was already producing results beyond what either of them had imagined possible. "Dr. Patterson, I need to ask you something," Taylor said, carefully. "Have you ever submitted requests for experimental treatment approval for Emma that were denied or delayed?" 3 times in the past 4 months, Dr. Patterson replied immediately. "Each time, I was told that the treatments weren't available or weren't appropriate for Emma's specific case profile." "And now?" "Now I'm looking at documentation showing that all 3 treatments have been available domestically, and Emma would have been approved for all of them if the applications had been processed normally." Dr. Patterson said, his voice carrying a note of professional outrage that Taylor had never heard from him before. Edward was already pulling up files on his laptop, cross-referencing Dr. Patterson's timeline with the evidence they'd gathered about Meridian Pharmaceuticals' interference patterns. "Dr. Patterson," Edward said, speaking toward the phone, "this is Edward Conklin, a financial investigator working with Taylor. Would you be willing to document the timeline of your treatment requests and the reasons you were given for the denials? Mr. Conklin, if someone has been deliberately interfering with my patient's access to treatment, I want to do everything possible to expose that interference," Dr. Patterson replied firmly. Taylor's phone was now buzzing constantly with messages from the growing network of families Edward had contacted. But what struck her most was the pattern emerging from their communications. Every family had been told their situation was unique, their loved one's case was too complex or too rare for available treatments. Yet when they began comparing notes, they realized they were all facing identical obstacles created by the same corporate manipulation. "Edward," Taylor said quietly, looking at the messages flooding her phone, "this is bigger than we thought, isn't it?" Edward nodded, his expression grim with the weight of what they were uncovering. "This is a systematic campaign to deny patients access to effective treatments while maximizing profit from less effective alternatives. We're not just fighting for Emma anymore, Taylor. We're fighting for every patient whose life has been considered acceptable collateral damage in Meridian Pharmaceuticals' profit optimization strategy." Taylor looked at the evidence covering her desk, at the messages from desperate families on her phone, at the man who had transformed from an invisible janitor into a strategic mastermind overnight. "Then we fight for all of them." By 8:30 a.m., Taylor's phone had become a constant stream of incoming calls, messages, and notifications. The network Edward had quietly built over 3 years was exploding into action. But with that momentum came unexpected complications that threatened to derail everything they'd worked to accomplish. The first sign of trouble came when Taylor tried to access her company email and found her account suspended. A terse message from IT security stated that her access had been revoked pending an investigation into unauthorized after-hours activity. "They know," Taylor said, staring at her laptop screen. "Somehow Marcus figured out that we were in his office." Edward looked up from his phone, where he'd been coordinating with Dr. Chen about Emma's potential enrollment in the Johns Hopkins trial. "Or Meridian Pharmaceutical has been monitoring communications more closely than we realized." Before Taylor could respond, her office phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus Pemberton's extension. "Don't answer it," Edward advised immediately. "If he's calling this early, it means he's been in contact with Meridian's legal team. Anything you say to him now could be used to discredit our evidence." But as Taylor's phone stopped ringing, Edward's phone immediately started buzzing with urgent messages from the families in their network. The first message made Taylor's stomach drop. Maria Santos's federal agents just showed up at her house asking questions about communications with Edward Conklin and Taylor Smith. "What's happening?" "Edward, look at this," Taylor said, showing him the message. Edward's expression darkened as he read additional messages flooding in. "Maria Santos, federal agents at her door. Dr. Liudo received a call from the DEA about suspicious pharmaceutical communications. Patricia Williams being questioned about potential conspiracy to interfere with FDA-approved treatments." "They're going after our witnesses," Taylor realized with her voice tight with panic. "Meridian Pharmaceutical is using federal agencies to intimidate the families we're trying to help." Edward was already pulling up files on his laptop, his military training evident in the speed and precision of his response. "This is more sophisticated than I anticipated. Meridian must have contacts within federal law enforcement who are willing to create harassment investigations to silence potential witnesses." Taylor's phone rang again, this time showing Dr. Patterson's number. She answered immediately, hoping for better news about Emma's condition. "Taylor, we have a serious problem," Dr. Patterson said without preamble. "I just received a call from the hospital's legal department. They have been contacted by federal investigators who claim that Emma's treatment is part of an ongoing investigation into pharmaceutical fraud." "What does that mean for Emma?" Taylor asked, but she already knew the answer. "It means the hospital administration is suspending all experimental treatment approvals pending resolution of the federal investigation," Dr. Patterson replied, his professional frustration evident. "Emma can't be enrolled in the Johns Hopkins trial, can't be referred for the Swiss treatment, and can't receive any interventions beyond standard chemotherapy protocols." Taylor felt the world collapsing around her again. Just hours after discovering a path to save Emma's life, that path was now being systematically blocked by the same forces they were trying to expose. "There has to be something we can do," Taylor said, her voice breaking with desperation. "We have evidence of their conspiracy. We have proof that they've been deliberately denying access to treatment."
Evidence that we obtained through unauthorized access to company files, Edward reminded her grimly. Meridian's legal team is probably arguing that our entire investigation is tainted by illegal activities. Taylor's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Taylor Smith, this is Attorney General Patricia Morrison's office. You and Edward Conklin need to report to the federal building immediately for questioning regarding alleged corporate espionage activities. Corporate espionage? Taylor read the message aloud, her voice rising with disbelief. They're treating us like criminals? Edward was quiet for a long moment, studying the messages on both their phones. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful calculation of someone reassessing a complex tactical situation. Taylor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. How far are you willing to go to save Emma's life? What do you mean? I mean that we're at a decision point where following legal procedures and working within official channels will almost certainly result in Emma's death, Edward explained. Meridian Pharmaceutical has more resources, better lawyers, and deeper connections within federal agencies than we anticipated. Taylor looked at Edward, seeing something in his expression that reminded her he'd once been trained for situations where conventional rules didn't apply. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we have approximately 6 hours before federal agents start looking for us seriously, Edward said, checking his watch. 6 hours to get Emma the treatment she needs through channels that bypass the legal obstacles Meridian Pharmaceutical has created. Illegal channels? Taylor asked, though her tone suggested she was considering the possibility rather than rejecting it. Extra-legal channels, Edward corrected. Dr. Chen at Johns Hopkins isn't the only doctor who's been frustrated by Meridian Pharmaceutical's interference. There's a network of physicians who've been developing workarounds for situations exactly like Emma's. Edward pulled up a secure messaging application on his phone, one that Taylor hadn't seen him use before. Dr. Michael Rodriguez in Mexico City has been treating American patients who can't access experimental treatments domestically. Dr. Elizabeth Mueller in Zurich has been accepting emergency patients outside the formal Swiss treatment program. Dr. James Kim in Vancouver has been running trials that aren't subject to FDA interference. You're talking about medical tourism, Taylor said, understanding dawning in her voice. I'm talking about a network of physicians who refuse to let patients die while bureaucrats and corporate lawyers play games with their lives. But it means Emma would need to be transported immediately before federal agents can prevent her from traveling. Taylor's phone rang again, this time showing a number with a 202 area code, Washington, D.C. She let it go to voicemail, but the message that followed made her blood run cold. Miss Smith, this is Special Agent Jennifer Walsh with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. You and Mr. Edward Conklin are persons of interest in an ongoing investigation into corporate espionage and conspiracy to interfere with pharmaceutical regulations. You are required to report to our field office within 4 hours for questioning. Failure to comply will result in federal warrants being issued for your arrest. 4 hours, Taylor said, looking at Edward with a mixture of fear and determination. They're not giving us time to think. Edward was already typing rapidly on his laptop, coordinating with contacts Taylor was just learning existed. Dr. Rodriguez can have Emma in Mexico City by this afternoon. The treatment protocol he's using has shown even better results than the Swiss program, and Mexican authorities don't recognize FDA interference in emergency medical situations. But that means abandoning everything, Taylor said. My job, my home, potentially never being able to return to the United States. It means saving Emma's life, Edward replied simply. Everything else can be rebuilt. Taylor thought about Emma lying in her hospital bed, unaware that corporate conspiracies and federal investigations were determining whether she lived or died. She thought about the months of financial devastation, the career sabotage, the systematic cruelty that had brought them to this impossible choice.
Edward, if we do this, if we take Emma out of the country for treatment, what happens to exposing Meridian Pharmaceuticals' conspiracy? Edward smiled grimly, pulling up files that showed the scope of his 3-year investigation. The evidence we've gathered doesn't disappear just because we're not here to present it. Dr. Chen has everything she needs to proceed with her FDA complaints. The families in our network have documentation of their own experiences. And I've been working with investigative journalists who've been building their own cases against Meridian Pharmaceutical. You've been working with journalists too? 3 years of night shifts gives you time to develop a lot of contacts. Sarah Walsh at the Washington Post has been investigating pharmaceutical pricing manipulation for 2 years. Michael Torres at 60 Minutes has been looking for exactly the kind of evidence we've uncovered. Edward's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Dr. Rodriguez. He answered immediately, speaking in rapid Spanish that Taylor couldn't follow, but recognized as urgent medical coordination. Dr. Rodriguez can begin treatment within 6 hours of Emma's arrival. But we need to move now. The medical transport I've arranged can have Emma in Mexico City by 3 p.m., before federal agents realize she's no longer in Northbridge General. Taylor looked at the evidence spread across her desk, at the messages from desperate families on her phone, at the man who had transformed her understanding of what was possible when people refused to accept that the system couldn't be challenged. "What about you?" she asked quietly. "You're risking everything too. Your son Danny, your life here."
Edward's expression softened for the first time since the federal pressure had begun mounting. "Danny's been asking me for 3 years why I can't help other kids whose parents are sick like his mom was. Maybe it's time I showed him that sometimes helping people means taking risks that seem impossible." Taylor made her decision with a clarity that surprised her. "Make the call to Dr. Rodriguez. Let's get Emma to Mexico City." As Edward began coordinating Emma's emergency transport, Taylor realized that in less than 12 hours, her quiet night janitor had revealed himself to be a strategic mastermind, a trained investigator, and now a man willing to risk everything to save her sister's life. The tissue he'd offered her the night before had been more than a simple gesture of kindness. It had been the beginning of the most complex rescue operation of her life. The medical transport coordination required precision that reminded Taylor of military operations she'd seen in movies, but Edward moved through the logistics with the calm efficiency of someone who'd orchestrated similar extractions before. Within 2 hours, he had assembled a team that defied everything Taylor thought she knew about emergency medical care. Dr. Amanda Foster, an emergency medicine physician who lost her medical license in the United States for refusing to deny treatment to uninsured patients, had been running medical evacuations to Mexico for 3 years. Her team included 2 paramedics who'd been blacklisted by American medical institutions for whistleblowing about insurance companies denying life-saving treatments, and a pilot whose private medical transport service specialized in cases where patients needed to circumvent bureaucratic obstacles. "The beauty of this network," Edward explained as they coordinated the logistics from Taylor's office, "is that everyone involved has been personally damaged by the same system we're fighting. They're not helping us for money. They're helping because they understand what it means to watch bureaucracy kill people." But the most surprising development came when Dr. Sarah Chen called with an update that changed the entire scope of their operation. "Edward, the evidence package you sent me has attracted attention from some very powerful allies," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying excitement Taylor hadn't heard before. "Senator Elizabeth Warren's office has been investigating pharmaceutical pricing manipulation for 2 years. They want to coordinate with us to turn Emma's case into a federal investigation that actually targets Meridian Pharmaceutical instead of protecting them." "What does that mean practically?" Taylor asked, putting the call on speaker. "It means that while you're getting Emma to safety in Mexico, Senator Warren's staff is preparing to hold emergency hearings about Meridian Pharmaceuticals' practices, but they need Emma's medical records and treatment documentation to establish the timeline of deliberate interference." Edward was already pulling up files on his laptop. "Dr. Chen, I have 3 years of documentation about similar cases. If Senator Warren's office can provide legal protection for the families in our network, we can give them evidence that goes far beyond Emma's situation." "That's exactly what they're hoping for," Dr. Chen replied. "But there's something else. The Washington Post and 60 Minutes aren't the only media outlets who've been tracking this story.
CNN has been investigating Meridian Pharmaceuticals' overseas pricing disparities for 6 months. They're ready to break the story as soon as they have on-the-record sources. Taylor felt a surge of hope that was almost overwhelming after the morning's federal pressure. You're saying that instead of running and hiding, we might actually be able to fight this publicly? I'm saying that Meridian Pharmaceuticals' attempt to use federal agencies to silence you has backfired spectacularly, Dr. Chen said. They've attracted attention from congressional oversight committees who don't appreciate being used as corporate enforcement tools. Edward's phone buzzed with an urgent message that made him frown with concern. Dr. Rodriguez says Mexican authorities have been contacted by someone claiming Emma is being kidnapped for illegal medical experimentation. They're threatening to deny entry to our medical transport. Meridian Pharmaceutical is moving faster than we anticipated, Taylor said, feeling the familiar weight of hopelessness beginning to settle over her again. But before Edward could respond, his phone rang with a call from an unknown international number. When he answered, Taylor heard a crisp British accent that cut through their crisis with unexpected authority. "Mr. Conklin, this is Dr. James Morrison, Director of Emergency Medical Services for Doctors Without Borders. Dr. Rodriguez contacted our organization about a patient being denied access to life-saving treatment due to corporate interference." Edward's eyes widened with surprise. "Dr. Morrison, how can Doctors Without Borders help with this situation involving American pharmaceutical companies?" "Mr. Conklin, Doctors Without Borders has been documenting Meridian Pharmaceuticals' interference with medical access in 12 countries for the past 4 years. We've been waiting for a case that would allow us to challenge their practices in international courts." Taylor leaned toward the phone. "Dr. Morrison, this is Taylor Smith, Emma's sister. What kind of international legal action are you talking about?" "Miss Smith, if your sister consents to treatment as part of our International Medical Refugee Program, she becomes subject to protections under the Geneva Convention regarding medical care for persons fleeing persecution. Meridian Pharmaceuticals' interference with her treatment could be classified as a crime against humanity." The scope of what they were facing was expanding beyond anything Taylor had imagined possible. What had started as a desperate attempt to save Emma's life was becoming an international incident involving congressional oversight, medical refugee protection, and potential crimes against humanity charges. "Dr. Morrison, what would Emma need to do to qualify for international medical protection?" Edward asked, his strategic mind already working through the implications. "She would need to formally request asylum in a country that recognizes medical persecution as grounds for refugee status. Canada, Switzerland, and the Netherlands all have established protocols for patients fleeing medical persecution by corporate entities." Taylor's phone rang with a call from Northbridge General Hospital. When she answered, Dr. Patterson's voice carried an urgency that made her heart race. "Taylor, you need to get to the hospital immediately," Dr. Patterson said. "Emma's condition has deteriorated significantly overnight. But more importantly, I've been contacted by the hospital's board of directors about something extraordinary." "What kind of extraordinary?" Taylor asked, fear making her voice tight. "The kind that suggests powerful people have been making phone calls on Emma's behalf," Dr. Patterson replied. "I just received authorization to begin experimental treatment protocols that were supposedly unavailable as recently as yesterday morning." Edward grabbed the phone. "Dr. Patterson, what specific treatments have been authorized?" "All of them," Dr. Patterson said, his voice carrying amazement. "The Johns Hopkins trial, the Swiss protocol, even treatments I've never heard of that apparently have been available all along. Someone with serious influence has been clearing bureaucratic obstacles faster than I've ever seen." Taylor looked at Edward, seeing her own confusion reflected in his expression. Who has that kind of influence? Edward's laptop chimed with an incoming secure message that made his eyes widen as he read it. "Taylor, look at this. It's from Senator Warren's chief of staff." The message was brief but stunning. "Mr. Conklin, the President has been briefed on Meridian Pharmaceuticals' interference with American patients' access to medical treatment. Executive order being prepared to classify medical access interference as a matter of national security. Emma Smith's treatment has been designated as a federal priority case." "The President?" Taylor whispered, hardly able to process what she was reading. Edward's phone immediately rang with a call from Washington, D.C. When he answered, Taylor heard a voice she recognized from television news. "Mr. Conklin, this is Congressman Michael Rodriguez, chairman of the House Oversight Committee. We've been investigating pharmaceutical pricing manipulation for 3 years, and the evidence you've provided has given us exactly what we need to hold Meridian Pharmaceutical accountable." "Congressman Rodriguez, how did our evidence reach the congressional level so quickly?" Edward asked. "Because Dr. Sarah Chen has been our medical consultant for 2 years," Congressman Rodriguez replied. "Every piece of evidence you've gathered has been forwarded directly to our oversight investigation. You've been building a federal case without realizing it." Taylor felt the world spinning around her as the scope of Edward's 3-year investigation became clear. He hadn't just been documenting corporate conspiracy, he'd been feeding information to a congressional investigation that had been building toward this moment for years. "Congressman, what does this mean for Emma's treatment?" Taylor asked. "It means that as of 1 hour ago, Meridian Pharmaceutical has been served with federal subpoenas for all records related to treatment access interference. It means that every bureaucratic obstacle they've created for Emma's treatment has been removed by executive order. And it means that your sister's case is going to be the foundation for the most comprehensive pharmaceutical reform legislation in 50 years. Edward's phone was now buzzing constantly with messages from the network of families he'd been coordinating with. But instead of fear and intimidation, the messages were filled with hope and gratitude. Federal agents apologized for this morning's harassment and explained that Meridian Pharmaceutical had been providing false information about ongoing criminal activities. "Hospital just called to say my daughter's treatment has been approved for immediate start. Insurance company that denied coverage yesterday just called to authorize full payment for experimental protocols. Dr. Chen says the Johns Hopkins trial is accepting emergency enrollments for all qualified patients." Taylor stared at the flood of positive messages, hardly able to believe what she was seeing. "Edward, how is this possible? How did everything change so quickly?" Edward closed his laptop and looked at Taylor with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Because for 3 years, I wasn't just cleaning offices and documenting corporate conspiracy. I was building a network that connected desperate families with the people who had power to actually help them." "What do you mean?" "I mean that every piece of evidence I gathered was shared with congressional investigators, medical advocacy organizations, international human rights groups, and investigative journalists," Edward explained. "I was never planning to fight Meridian Pharmaceutical alone. I was building a coalition that could take them down systematically." Taylor's phone rang with a call from Dr. Patterson. When she answered, his voice carried relief and excitement. "Taylor, Emma is being prepared for immediate transport to Johns Hopkins," Dr. Patterson said. "Dr. Chen's team will begin the experimental protocol this afternoon. Full federal medical protection, no cost to your family, and unlimited access to any treatments that might help." Taylor felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of relief rather than desperation. "Dr. Patterson, is she going to be okay?" "Taylor, with the treatments now available to her, Emma has every reason to expect full recovery," Dr. Patterson replied. "But more than that, her case is going to make sure that no other family faces the obstacles you've been fighting." As Taylor hung up the phone, she looked at Edward with new understanding. He hadn't just been a janitor who noticed her struggles. He had been a strategic mastermind who spent 3 years building the most comprehensive medical justice operation she could have imagined. "Edward, who are you really?" Edward smiled, and for the first time since their conversation began, he looked like the quiet, dignified man who had silently handed her a tissue 12 hours ago. "I'm a father who lost his wife to a broken system, and I decided that no other family should have to go through what Danny and I went through. Everything else was just the tools I used to make that happen."
The transformation at Northbridge General Hospital was unlike anything Taylor had ever witnessed.
When she arrived at Emma's room, she found her sister surrounded by a medical team that included not only Dr. Patterson, but also Dr. Sarah Chen from Johns Hopkins, a representative from the CDC's Pharmaceutical Oversight Division, and 2 federal agents who were there to ensure that no further interference occurred with Emma's treatment. Taylor, Emma's voice was weak but filled with confusion and hope. Dr. Patterson says I'm being transferred to Johns Hopkins for some kind of experimental treatment that wasn't available yesterday. And there are federal agents here asking about pharmaceutical companies trying to prevent my treatment? I don't understand what's happening. Taylor sat beside Emma's bed, taking her sister's hand while trying to process how to explain the events of the past 24 hours. Emma, remember how I've been working late trying to save my job? It turns out that my supervisor has been deliberately sabotaging my career to prevent you from getting the treatment you need. Emma's eyes widened with disbelief. That's impossible. Why would your boss care about my medical treatment? Before Taylor could answer, Dr. Chen stepped forward with a gentle but professional demeanor. Emma, your sister discovered that a pharmaceutical company has been systematically preventing patients like you from accessing effective treatments in order to protect their domestic profit margins. Your case has become the foundation for a federal investigation that's going to change how experimental treatments are made available to patients. I'm part of a federal investigation? Emma asked, looking between Taylor and Dr. Chen with amazement. You're the reason for a federal investigation, Dr. Chen corrected. The evidence your sister and her colleague gathered about interference with your treatment access has exposed a conspiracy that affects thousands of patients across the country. Edward appeared in the doorway, but he looked different than he had during their long night of planning and coordination. Gone was the janitor's uniform, replaced by a well-tailored suit that reminded Taylor of his previous career as a financial analyst. More striking was the way he carried himself, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to high-stakes operations. Emma, Taylor said, I want you to meet Edward Conklin. He's the person who figured out what was being done to prevent your treatment, and he's the one who made sure you'll get the help you need. Emma looked at Edward with curiosity and gratitude. Mr. Conklin, Taylor says you've been investigating pharmaceutical companies. Are you some kind of federal agent? Edward smiled, approaching Emma's bed with the same gentle dignity Taylor had observed during his night janitor shifts. I'm a father whose wife died from cancer 3 years ago, and I decided that no other family should face the obstacles my family faced. Everything I've done has been to make sure patients like you can access the treatments that might save your lives. But how did you know about the conspiracy against my treatment? Emma asked. Because I've been working night shifts at the building where your sister works, and I've been documenting similar cases for 3 years. What happened to you wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic pattern of denying patients access to effective treatments. Dr. Chen consulted her tablet, then looked at Emma with professional optimism. Emma, the treatment protocol we're starting this afternoon has shown remarkable success rates in patients with your specific cancer markers. Based on your latest lab results, we have every reason to expect significant improvement within the first 2 weeks. And it's really free? Emma asked, still struggling to understand the sudden change in her situation. It's federally funded as part of the investigation into pharmaceutical access interference. Not only will your treatment be provided at no cost, but you're also entitled to compensation for the delays and additional suffering caused by the deliberate interference with your care. Taylor's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. When she answered, she heard a voice that made her realize the scope of what Edward had orchestrated was still expanding. Miss Smith, this is Margaret Torres, senior producer for 60 Minutes. We're preparing a segment about pharmaceutical companies denying patients access to life-saving treatments, and we'd like to feature your sister's story as the centerpiece of our investigation. 60 Minutes wants to feature Emma's story? Taylor asked, looking at Edward with amazement. We've been investigating Meridian pharmaceutical practices for 8 months. The evidence Mr. Conklin provided has given us exactly what we needed to expose their systematic manipulation of patient access to treatments. Edward stepped closer to the phone. Miss Torres, this is Edward Conklin. What kind of impact are you expecting from the 60-minute segment? Mr. Conklin, based on our preliminary investigation, we believe this story will result in congressional hearings, federal criminal charges against Meridian pharmaceutical executives, and comprehensive reform of how experimental treatments are made available to patients. Emma's case represents thousands of families who've been denied access to treatments that could save their loved ones' lives. Emma looked around the room at the medical team, federal agents, and media attention surrounding her case. This feels surreal. Yesterday I was dying from cancer that couldn't be treated, and today I'm part of a federal investigation that's going to be on national television? Yesterday you were being murdered by corporate greed. Today you're going to live, and your survival is going to make sure other patients don't face the same obstacles. Dr. Patterson stepped forward with Emma's treatment schedule. Emma, the transport to Johns Hopkins leaves in 2 hours. Dr. Chen's team will begin the experimental protocol this afternoon, and based on similar cases, we should see measurable improvement within 72 hours.
Dr. Patterson, Taylor asked, what would have happened if we hadn't discovered the conspiracy? How long did Emma really have? Dr. Patterson's expression grew somber. Based on the progression rate we were seeing with standard treatments, Emma probably had less than 2 weeks. The experimental protocol that's now available to her has the potential to not only save her life, but to achieve complete remission. Taylor felt the full weight of how close they had come to losing Emma and how dramatically Edward's intervention had changed everything. Edward, I still don't understand how you knew to investigate pharmaceutical companies. What made you realize that Emma's situation was part of a larger conspiracy? Edward was quiet for a moment, looking at Emma with an expression that reminded Taylor of the way he'd looked at his wife's medical records 3 years earlier. Because when Jessica was dying, I started noticing patterns in how insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies coordinated to deny access to experimental treatments. I realized that the obstacles we faced weren't bureaucratic incompetence, they were deliberate strategies to maximize profit by limiting access to effective treatments. So you've been investigating this for 3 years? Emma asked. I've been building a case for 3 years, Edward corrected. Working night shifts gave me access to corporate communications that revealed how the system really works. Every family I've helped has contributed evidence that's made the case stronger. Emma's phone rang with a call from a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, Taylor heard a voice that made her realize their story was about to reach an even larger audience. Emma Smith, this is Dr. Michael Rodriguez calling from Mexico City. I wanted to personally thank you for the courage your family has shown in exposing the conspiracy that's been denying patients access to my treatment protocols. Dr. Rodriguez, how do you know about our situation? Emma asked. Because Mr. Conklin has been coordinating with physicians like me for years, documenting cases where American patients were being denied access to treatments available internationally, Dr. Rodriguez replied. Your case has given us the evidence we needed to file formal complaints with international medical authorities about Meridian Pharmaceuticals' interference with global treatment access. Edward's laptop chimed with incoming messages that made him smile with satisfaction. Emma, the network of families we've been working with is reporting similar breakthroughs. 17 patients who were being denied experimental treatments received approval this afternoon. The Johns Hopkins trial is accepting emergency enrollments for qualified patients. Insurance companies are reversing denials that were made for suspicious reasons. How many people are going to be helped because of what happened to me? Emma asked. Based on our current documentation, probably thousands, Edward replied. But more importantly, the systemic changes that your case is triggering will prevent similar interference for future patients. Dr. Chen looked up from coordinating Emma's transport logistics.
"Emma, there's something else you should know. The treatment protocol you're about to receive is being fast-tracked for FDA approval based on the evidence of interference with patient access. Within 6 months, this treatment will be available domestically to any patient who needs it." Emma looked around the room at the extraordinary team that had assembled to ensure her survival and prevent similar suffering for other patients. "A week ago, I thought I was going to die because there weren't any treatments available for my cancer. Now I'm going to live, and my case is going to help save other people's lives too?" "That's exactly right," Edward said, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd spent 3 years working toward this moment. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept that the system can't be changed." Taylor looked at Edward with overwhelming gratitude and amazement. "Edward, how do I even begin to thank you for everything you've done?" Edward smiled, and for a moment he looked like the gentle janitor who had quietly handed her a tissue the night before. "By watching Emma start her teaching career next fall, and by knowing that no other family will have to go through what you've been through." As the medical team began preparing Emma for transport to Johns Hopkins, Taylor realized that the tissue had offered her hadn't just been a gesture of kindness. It had been the beginning of the most comprehensive medical justice operation she could have imagined. 6 months later, Taylor stood in the gallery of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room, watching as the final phase of the most comprehensive pharmaceutical reform investigation in American history reached its climax. Below her, Meridian Pharmaceuticals' former CEO, Marcus Pemberton, and 12 other executives sat at the witness table, facing questions from senators who had spent months reviewing the evidence Edward had meticulously gathered over 3 years. The transformation had been extraordinary to witness. What had begun as Edward's quiet documentation of corporate conspiracy had evolved into federal legislation known as the Emma Smith Medical Access Protection Act, which mandated that any experimental treatment showing efficacy rates above 30% must be made available to qualified patients regardless of their ability to pay. Emma sat beside Taylor in the gallery, her hair grown back in soft curls after completing her treatment at Johns Hopkins 5 months earlier. The experimental protocol had exceeded even Dr. Chen's optimistic projections. Emma had achieved complete remission within 6 weeks and had been declared cancer-free for the past 3 months. More remarkably, she was scheduled to begin her teaching career the following month, exactly as she had planned before her diagnosis. "Miss Smith," Senator Elizabeth Warren's voice carried clearly through the hearing room's audio system, "would you please tell the committee about your sister's experience with Meridian Pharmaceuticals' treatment access interference?"
Taylor stood and approached the witness microphone, still amazed that she was testifying before the U.S. Senate about corporate conspiracy and medical justice. The past 6 months had transformed her from a struggling marketing executive into a leading advocate for pharmaceutical reform, working with Edward and Dr. Chan to document similar cases and push for systemic changes. "Senator Warren, my sister Emma nearly died not because effective treatment didn't exist, but because Meridian Pharmaceutical deliberately prevented her from accessing treatment that could save her life," Taylor began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Their conspiracy involved manipulating insurance coverage, interfering with doctor referrals, and coordinating with supervisors at my workplace to ensure I couldn't afford the treatments Emma needed." The hearing room was silent as Taylor described the months of financial devastation, the deliberately sabotaged client relationships, and the systematic cruelty that had nearly cost Emma her life. But what had the greatest impact was when she explained how Edward's investigation had revealed the scope of Meridian Pharmaceuticals' patient manipulation programs. "Senator Warren, what the committee needs to understand is that Emma's case wasn't unique," Taylor continued. "Edward Conklin's investigation documented over 200 similar cases where Meridian Pharmaceutical deliberately interfered with patient access to experimental treatments. Patients died not because medicine couldn't help them, but because helping them wasn't profitable enough."
Senator Warren nodded, then turned to address the former Meridian Pharmaceutical executives. Mr. Harrison, as former CEO of Meridian Pharmaceutical, how do you respond to testimony that your company deliberately prevented patients from accessing life-saving treatments? David Harrison, who had been Meridian's CEO during the conspiracy, looked uncomfortable as he leaned toward his microphone. Senator Warren, Meridian Pharmaceutical has always operated within applicable regulatory frameworks. Our domestic pricing strategies were designed to ensure sustainable access to treatments for American patients. Mr. Harrison, Senator Warren interrupted, holding up a document that Taylor recognized as part of Edward's evidence package. This is an internal Meridian Pharmaceutical memo dated 18 months ago, discussing acceptable patient mortality rates to maintain optimal profit margins on experimental protocols. How do you explain a company document that treats patient deaths as acceptable business costs? The hearing room erupted with shocked murmurs as Harrison struggled to respond. Taylor felt a surge of satisfaction watching the evidence Edward had gathered systematically destroy Meridian Pharmaceutical's attempts to justify their actions. Furthermore, Senator Warren continued, this committee has reviewed financial records showing that Meridian Pharmaceutical paid consulting fees totaling over $3 million to insurance executives, hospital administrators, and corporate supervisors to create barriers preventing patient access to treatments. Mr. Harrison, how is paying people to deny patients medical care operating within regulatory frameworks? Taylor looked across the hearing room to where Edward sat with the legal team representing the families affected by Meridian Pharmaceutical's conspiracy. He was wearing the same well-tailored suit she'd first seen him in at the hospital, but his expression carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd spent 3 years building toward this moment of accountability. Beside Edward sat Dr. Sarah Chan, who had become the leading medical expert witness in the federal case against Meridian Pharmaceutical. Dr. Chan's testimony earlier in the hearings had provided the clinical evidence showing that Meridian's interference had directly caused patient deaths that could have been prevented with available treatments. Mr. Harrison, Senator Warren's voice carried the authority of someone who had built her career fighting corporate abuse. Dr. Chan's analysis indicates that Meridian Pharmaceutical's treatment access interference resulted in approximately 147 preventable patient deaths over the past 3 years. How do you justify corporate policies that prioritize profit margins over patient survival? Harrison's legal counsel whispered urgently in his ear before he responded. Senator Warren, Meridian Pharmaceutical disputes the methodology used to calculate those mortality statistics. Our position remains that we operated within industry standards for experimental treatment access. Taylor felt anger rising as she listened to Harrison's evasions. Emma could have been one of those 147 preventable deaths if Edward hadn't intervened. The callousness of treating patient mortality as a statistical dispute was exactly the kind of corporate indifference that Edward's investigation had been designed to expose. Mr. Harrison, Senator Warren said, her voice carried barely controlled outrage, let me be very clear about something. This committee has reviewed 3 years of your company's internal communications. We have documented evidence of deliberate conspiracy to deny patients access to life-saving treatments. We have financial records showing systematic bribery of healthcare officials to create artificial barriers preventing patient access to treatments. Senator Warren paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the hearing room. What we're discussing here isn't industry standards or regulatory compliance. What we're discussing is a criminal conspiracy that resulted in the deaths of American citizens for corporate profit. The hearing room was completely silent as Senator Warren continued. The evidence this committee has reviewed indicates that Meridian Pharmaceutical executives should face federal criminal charges for conspiracy, racketeering, and criminally negligent homicide. The Department of Justice has informed this committee that federal indictments will be unsealed following the conclusion of these hearings.
Taylor felt a surge of vindication that was almost overwhelming. The federal criminal charges meant that Marcus Pemberton and the Meridian Pharmaceutical executives would face serious prison time for what they had done to Emma and the other patients whose lives they had manipulated. Senator Warren, Harrison's legal counsel interrupted, "My client would like to request a brief recess to consult with counsel about potential cooperation with federal investigators." Mr. Harrison, the time for cooperation was 3 years ago, when your company first began implementing policies that prioritize profit over patient survival. This committee is not interested in plea negotiations. We are interested in ensuring that no other American family faces the obstacles that the Smith family overcame.
Taylor looked down at Emma, who was following the proceedings with the same amazement Taylor felt about how dramatically their lives had changed. 6 months ago, Emma had been dying from cancer that was supposedly untreatable. Now she was watching the executives who had nearly killed her being held accountable for their actions on national television. The committee will now hear testimony from Mr. Edward Conklin, Senator Warren announced, whose 3-year investigation provided the evidence that exposed Meridian Pharmaceuticals' conspiracy and saved countless patients' lives. Edward approached the witness table with the same quiet dignity Taylor had observed during their first conversation in her office. As he settled at the microphone, Taylor realized that this moment represented the culmination of everything Edward had been working towards since his wife's death, ensuring that other families wouldn't face the impossible choices he and Danny had endured. "Mr. Conklin," Senator Warren began, "your investigation into pharmaceutical access interference has resulted in federal legislation, criminal charges against corporate executives, and systematic reforms that will protect future patients. Can you tell this committee what motivated you to undertake such a comprehensive investigation?" Edward looked directly at the senators, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 3 years documenting corporate conspiracy with methodical precision. "Senator Warren, my wife Jessica died from pancreatic cancer 3 years ago after we exhausted our financial resources trying to access experimental treatments that insurance companies claimed weren't available. After Jessica's death, I realized that the obstacles we faced weren't bureaucratic inefficiency. They were deliberate strategies designed to maximize pharmaceutical company profits by limiting patient access to effective treatments." "And what did you discover during your investigation?" "I discovered that pharmaceutical companies have been systematically manipulating the American healthcare system to deny patients access to treatments that could save their lives," Edward replied. "They've been bribing insurance executives to deny coverage, paying hospital administrators to limit referrals, and coordinating with employers to ensure that patients can't afford the treatments they need." Edward paused, his expression reflecting the weight of 3 years spent documenting corporate cruelty. "Senator Warren, what I discovered is that American healthcare isn't failing because we don't have effective treatments. It's failing because profitable companies have designed it to fail for anyone who can't afford to pay premium prices for basic human compassion." As Edward's testimony continued, Taylor realized that the tissue he had handed her 6 months earlier had been more than a gesture of kindness. It had been the beginning of the most comprehensive challenge to corporate medical abuse in American history. 1 year later, Taylor walked through the corridors of the newly established Emma Smith Medical Justice Center, a facility that had risen from the ruins of Meridian Pharmaceuticals' former headquarters. The irony wasn't lost on her that the building where corporate executives had once plotted to deny patients access to life-saving treatments had been transformed into a center dedicated to ensuring that no patient would ever again face the obstacles her family had overcome. The transformation had been funded by the federal government's seizure of Meridian Pharmaceuticals' assets following the conviction of its executives. Marcus Pemberton was serving a 12-year federal sentence for conspiracy and racketeering, while former CEO David Harrison had received 15 years for his role in what federal prosecutors had termed the most systematic medical access conspiracy in American history. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't the building. It was the lives that had been saved and restored through the comprehensive reforms that Edward's investigation had triggered. 1 year later, Taylor walked through the corridors of the newly established Emma Smith Medical Justice Center, a facility that had risen from the ruins of Meridian Pharmaceuticals' former headquarters. The irony wasn't lost on her that the building where corporate executives had once plotted to deny patients access to life-saving treatments had been transformed into a center dedicated to ensuring that no patient would ever again face the obstacles her family had overcome. The transformation had been funded by the federal government's seizure of Meridian Pharmaceuticals' assets following the conviction of its executives. Marcus Pemberton was serving a 12-year federal sentence for conspiracy and racketeering, while former CEO David Harrison had received 15 years for his role in what federal prosecutors had termed the most systematic medical access conspiracy in American history. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't the building. It was the lives that had been saved and restored through the comprehensive reforms that Edward's investigation had triggered. "Taylor, you need to see this," Edward called from his office, where he now served as Director of Corporate Medical Accountability, a position created specifically to investigate and prevent pharmaceutical companies from manipulating patient access to treatments. Taylor found Edward reviewing the latest statistics from the Emma Smith Medical Access Protection Act, which had been signed into law 8 months earlier. The numbers were staggering in their impact on American healthcare. Over 12,000 patients have received access to experimental treatments that were previously denied through corporate manipulation, Edward explained, pointing to graphs that showed the dramatic increase in treatment approvals following the new legislation. Average treatment costs have decreased by 63% because pharmaceutical companies can no longer maintain artificial pricing through access restrictions. "And the mortality statistics?" Taylor asked, though she already knew the answer would be remarkable. "Preventable deaths from cancer, rare diseases, and other conditions requiring experimental treatments have decreased by 47%, Edward replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had spent years working toward exactly these results. Taylor looked around Edward's office, noting the wall covered with photographs and letters from families whose lives had been saved by the reforms his investigation had triggered. Each image represented someone who would have faced the same impossible choices Taylor and Emma had confronted, but who now have access to treatments that could save their lives. "Emma's here for her 1-year appointment," Taylor said, checking her watch. "Dr. Chen wants to document her progress for the medical journals that are publishing studies about the treatment protocols that Meridian Pharmaceutical tried to suppress." Edward smiled, closing his laptop and following Taylor toward the medical wing of the facility. "Has Emma decided whether she wants to speak at the International Conference on Medical Access Reform next month?" "She's still nervous about the attention," Taylor replied, "but she understands that her story could help establish similar protections in other countries. Dr. Chen says that European authorities are using our legislation as a model for their own pharmaceutical reform initiatives." They found Emma in Dr. Chen's office, looking remarkably healthy and vibrant as she completed her latest round of tests. The experimental treatment had not only saved her life, but had restored her to better health than she'd enjoyed even before her cancer diagnosis.
"Emma, how are you feeling about starting the new school year?" Dr. Chen asked as she reviewed Emma's test results. "Excited and terrified," Emma replied honestly. "It's surreal to think that a year ago I was dying from cancer, and now I'm about to teach kindergarten like I always planned. Sometimes I wake up thinking this whole recovery might be a dream." Dr. Chen looked up from her tablet with a warm smile. "Emma, your test results show no trace of cancer markers. Your immune system is functioning at optimal levels, and based on every indicator we can measure, you are completely healthy. This isn't a dream. This is what happens when patients get access to the treatments they need without interference from corporate profit motives." Taylor felt the familiar surge of gratitude that had become a constant part of her life over the past year. Emma's recovery was miraculous not because the treatment was experimental, but because they had been able to access treatment that pharmaceutical companies had deliberately kept hidden from patients who needed it. "Dr. Chen," Emma said, "I've been thinking about the other patients who didn't have someone like Edward watching out for them. The ones who died because they couldn't access the treatments that saved my life." Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious. "Emma, that's exactly why your story is so important to share. The Emma Smith Medical Justice Center has documented over 3,000 cases of patients who died from treatable conditions because pharmaceutical companies created artificial barriers to treatment access. 3,000 people, Emma repeated, her voice heavy with the weight of understanding what those numbers represented. 3,000 families who went through what Taylor and I went through, but without Edward's investigation to save them. Edward joined the conversation from where he'd been reviewing Emma's case file. Emma, those 3,000 families are the reason we're working to establish similar medical justice centers in 12 other countries. Their deaths weren't meaningless if we can prevent similar tragedies from happening to other families. Taylor's phone buzzed with a message that made her smile. Danny wants to know if Emma will help him with his science fair project about how pharmaceutical companies used to prevent people from getting medicine. Edward's son is doing his science fair project about pharmaceutical reform? Emma asked with amusement. Danny's been telling everyone at school that his dad is a superhero who saves people from bad medicine companies. Apparently his classmates are very impressed that his father helped pass federal legislation. Dr. Chen completed her review of Emma's test results and closed her tablet with satisfaction. Emma, from a medical perspective, I can officially say that you've achieved complete recovery with no risk of recurrence. But more importantly, your case has established treatment protocols that are now saving lives around the world. What do you mean, around the world? The treatment protocol that saved Emma's life has been implemented in medical centers across Europe, Asia, and South America. International medical authorities have recognized that the research Meridian Pharmaceutical tried to suppress represents breakthrough advances in cancer treatment. Emma looked thoughtful for a moment, then turned to Edward with a curious gratitude. Edward, I need to ask you something I've been wondering about for months. When you first handed Taylor that tissue, did you already know that you were going to expose the entire conspiracy? Edward was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the careful honesty that Taylor had come to recognize as one of his defining characteristics. Emma, I knew that Meridian Pharmaceutical was manipulating patient access to treatments, and I knew that your situation was part of a larger pattern, but I didn't know that handing Taylor a tissue would trigger federal legislation and international medical reform. But, so what did you know? Emma asked. I knew that your sister was fighting the same impossible battle that Jessica and I had fought. I knew that the system was rigged against families like ours. And I knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept that people have to die because helping them isn't profitable enough. Taylor looked at Edward, remembering the quiet janitor who had offered her a tissue during the darkest moment of her life. Edward, do you ever regret giving up your original career to become a janitor? Do you wish you'd stayed in financial analysis instead of starting this investigation? Edward smiled, looking around Dr. Chen's office at the evidence of Emma's complete recovery, at the photographs of families whose lives had been saved by the reforms his investigation had triggered, at the medical justice center that had emerged from his 3-year documentation of corporate conspiracy. Taylor, being a financial analyst gave me the skills to investigate corporate fraud, but being a janitor gave me access to the evidence I needed to save lives. Sometimes the most important work you do happens when nobody's paying attention to what you're doing. Emma stood up, her medical appointment completed and her future secured. Edward, I have something I want to give you. She pulled out a small wooden frame containing a photograph of her kindergarten classroom, already decorated and ready for the new school year. In the corner of the photo was a small plaque that read, "This classroom is dedicated to Edward Conklin, who showed us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is notice when someone needs help." Edward, I can't accept this, Edward protested, though his voice carried obvious emotion.
You're not accepting it, Emma replied firmly. You're earning it. Every day for the rest of your life, you're going to know that children are learning and growing in a classroom that exists because you refuse to let pharmaceutical companies treat people like disposable profit centers. Taylor watched as Edward accepted the photograph, understanding that this simple gesture represented the completion of a journey that had begun with a tissue offered in the darkness of a corporate office building. You know what the most remarkable thing about this whole experience has been? Taylor said, looking at Edward and Emma together.
It's that none of this would have happened if Edward hadn't been paying attention. If he hadn't noticed that I was struggling, if he hadn't cared enough to document what he was seeing, if he hadn't believed that one person's compassion could actually change an entire system. Edward looked at the photograph Emma had given him, then at the medical center that surrounded them, filled with patients receiving treatments that would have been denied to them just a year earlier. Sometimes, Edward said quietly, the most important thing you can do is hand someone a tissue when they're crying. Everything else just follows from refusing to ignore other people's pain. As they walked together through the Emma Smith Medical Justice Center, past offices filled with investigators working to prevent medical access conspiracies, past treatment rooms where patients were receiving life-saving care without financial barriers, past meeting rooms where families were learning about resources that could help their loved ones, Taylor realized that the tissue Edward had offered her hadn't just been a gesture of kindness. It had been the beginning of the most comprehensive transformation of American healthcare in a generation, all because one person had refused to accept that the system couldn't be changed, and one family had been brave enough to fight back when they discovered that their struggles weren't caused by medical limitations. They were caused by corporate greed that treated human life as an acceptable cost of doing business. The revolution had begun with a tissue offered in darkness, and it had ended with light flooding into every corner of a system that had once thrived on keeping families in desperate isolation. Now, no one would have to fight alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.